As we continue our worldview journey, we finally get to the point where we come to what is called the Middle Ages, where we're going to actually do a little bit of examination of what is called, the medieval worldview. Now, medieval, Middle Ages, all this kind of signifies a time period in the middle of two things. And of course, what those two things are, first of all, is the Roman Empire, which comes to an end along about 476 AD. And then later, when the church is challenged in the Reformation in the 16th century. So when we're talking about the medieval time period, the medieval worldview or Middle Ages, we're talking about roughly about 500 to 1500 AD, which is kind of a nice 1,000-year time period to work with. What happens during this time period is what we need to look at here. How do people change in their way of understanding things? What is the culture like? What do medieval people think like? What is important to them? Now, of course, as you see by a picture of a church, a Gothic cathedral during this time period, we see that the church is going to be dominant during this era, especially as the Roman Empire just kind of fritters away. It's not some big cataclysm when it ends. It's something that has just kind of happened gradually over decades, and finally it's just not there anymore. And so the medieval worldview picks up at the end of the Roman Empire. There's one book that I really appreciate. It's called How the Irish Saved Civilization by Thomas Cahill. It's one that I recommend that people read because it's kind of one of the forgotten aspects of this medieval period. It's kind of a transition period that takes place, first of all, because what we're seeing is, how some people have used the term the Dark Ages and they try to apply it to the entire medieval period. That's really not accurate. The Dark Ages, if there is a Dark Age, is simply the time period immediately after the fall of Rome for the next maybe couple of centuries, but things are starting to pick up even during that time. And we have people like the Irish, the monks in Ireland who have become Christians, totally contrary, separated from what's taking place in the Roman Empire prior to that time. You have people like what we know now as St. Patrick, who had never even gone to Rome and didn't really know much about what was happening there. And so these things develop in Ireland in a separate way. So in this book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, the author Cahill says, as the Roman Empire fell, as all through Europe, matted, unwashed barbarians descended on the Roman cities, looting artifacts and burning books, the Irish, who were just learning to read and write, took up the great labor of copying all of Western literature, everything they could lay their hands on. It's kind of ironic in one sense. In the rest of Europe, books are being burned and things are in chaos, but in Ireland, it's kind of going the other direction. He goes on to say, these scribes then served as conduits through which the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian cultures were transmitted to the tribes of Europe, newly settled amid the rubble and ruined vineyards of the civilization they had overwhelmed. Without this service of the scribes, as he calls it, everything that happened subsequently would have been unthinkable. Without this service of the scribes, as he calls it, everything that happened subsequently would have been unthinkable. They offered something that was not at this time being offered by the church coming out of Rome. He says, without the mission of the Irish monks, who single-handedly refounded European civilization throughout the continent in the bays and valleys of their exile, the world that came after them would have been an entirely different one, a world without books, and our own world would never have come to be. And we're very used to talking about the monks during the Middle Ages as scribes and making sure that culture gets transcribed and carried on to the next generation. But a lot of that starts right up here with the Irish. Call them the people of the Dark Ages if you will, Cahill says, but do not underestimate the desire of these early medieval men and women for the rule of law. There was, moreover, one office that survived intact from the classical to the medieval polis, and that was the office of Catholic bishop. Okay? And finally, he says, in late antiquity, as municipal and provincial governments disintegrated and imperial appointees abandoned their posts because there's a lot of chaos taking place, there was one official who could be counted on to stay with his people even to death, the episkopos, a Greek word meaning overseer or superintendent. Okay? Another author who was well-versed in what took place during this time period, Christopher Dawson, wrote Religion and the rise of Western culture, in which he said the following as we look at the end of the Roman Empire and what comes afterwards. He says, "The Christian church inherited the traditions of the empire. It came to the barbarians as the bearer of a higher civilization, endowed with the prestige of Roman law and the authority of the Roman name. The breakdown of the political organization of the empire left a great void, which no barbarian king or general could fill. And this void was filled by the church as the teacher and lawgiver of the new peoples." Okay? He goes on to say, "The people of the north possessed no written literature, no cities, no stone architecture. They were, in short, barbarians, and it was only by Christianity and the elements of a higher culture transmitted to them by the church that Western Europe acquired unity and form." Okay? We have to remember that at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, the main centers of Christian culture, the majority of the Christian population, were still non-European. We're so focused all the time on the Western civilization, but the mother tongue of the church was Greek. Its theological development was mainly due to Asiatic Greek councils and Asiatic Greek theologians at a time when in the Latin West, paganism was still strong, and the ruling classes, far more the rural population, was still largely non-Christian in culture and tradition. So what we see is that we have two different cultures present during this time period in the West and in the East. In the East, it's going to be the Orthodox Church that has maintained its continuity throughout this time. It's in the West where things fell apart. Okay? Now, in the West, though, in Western Europe, it was in the monasteries, as I've already kind of mentioned, rather than in the cities, that the tradition of Latin culture, the patterns of Christian life, were preserved. The monks were the apostles of the West and the founders of medieval culture. Okay? Now, I know quite often I like to point to C.S. Lewis and what he says about things, and I want to make sure I do that in this particular case because he was an expert on the Middle Ages and the medieval character. One of his books is called The Discarded Image. Not one of his most famous books because people, like to read the others that are easier, but this scholarly book is extremely important as he explains what these people thought during this time period. It fits in beautifully with what we're talking about here with worldviews and culture and so forth. And so in this book, Lewis, says the following things. He says, first of all, Lewis emphasizes that the overwhelmingly bookish or clerkly character of medieval culture. When we speak of the Middle Ages as the ages of authority, we are usually thinking about the authority of the church, which is true, but they were the age not only of her authority, but of authorities. Now, the first thing you might note here is I'd never thought of the Middle Ages as a bookish culture because, not that many people could read and so forth. But Lewis feels like that was very central to things. He says, if their culture is regarded as a response to environment, then the elements in that environment to which it responded most vigorously were manuscripts. Now, that again goes back to what we talked about here, about the monks, and they're transcribing things and making sure that culture and civilization of the past is not lost, and the Christian culture of the time too. Lewis goes on to say, in a savage community, and by savage community he means a community that didn't have most literacy, okay, most people were not literate. In a savage community you absorb your culture, in part unconsciously, from participation in the immemorial pattern of behavior, and in part by word of mouth from the old men of the tribe, things handed down orally from one generation to the next. In our own society, most knowledge depends, in the last resort, on observation. Okay? But the Middle Ages, he says, depended predominantly on books. Though literacy was, of course, far rarer than now, reading was in one way a more important ingredient of the total culture. Now that's kind of fascinating. As I already mentioned, literacy was not very high during this time period, but reading of those who could read is a very important ingredient. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are written during the Middle Ages that most people are totally unaware of. He says there is a sense in which the romances and ballads perhaps really deserve to rank as the characteristic or representative product of the Middle Ages. There's a lot of romances and ballads out there. Another book that Lewis wrote called The Allegory of Love talks about a lot of these things that are written during the Middle Ages. Again, what I think we need to do here is maybe get our mind changed on the whole concept of these Middle Ages. They weren't really a time when everything was barbaric and when there was absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. Even the people who could not read were focused upon the truths that they were being given through the church, and their life was actually operating on those things that they were taught. And those who were more literate were very busy producing things that we can still read today. He says, at his most characteristic, medieval man was not a dreamer nor a wanderer. He was an organizer, a codifier, a builder of systems. Now, again, one of those things that might go contrary to our predisposed ideas of what the Middle Ages are like. He said he wanted, quote, a place for everything and everything in the right place. Distinction, definition, tabulation were his delight. Though full of turbulent activities, he was equally full of the impulse to formalize them. Right? So there's a desire to order in the Middle Ages. Everything in its right place. And that's a phrase that we even use even today. Okay? And look, different examples that Lewis gives. War was formalized. You might say, that sounds weird, but there have always been rules of war. There are certain things that you're not supposed to do. And this comes out strongly in the Middle Ages. War was formalized by the art of heraldry, the rules of chivalry. What do we see in our time now? We see really, with terrorism and things like that, and during World War I with poison gas, and they had to eventually outlaw that, and World War II with the Holocaust. I mean, what happened to the art of heraldry, the rules of chivalry? It's almost like, anything can go now. There's no rules to these things. Rules on sexual passion, he says, by an elaborate code of love. In other words, there's certain boundaries on these things. Highly original, soaring philosophical speculation squeezes itself, he says, into a rigid dialectical pattern copied from Aristotle. Oh, Aristotle somebody they know? Yes, he is. Studies like law and moral theology, which demand the ordering of very diverse particulars, especially flourish. The Middle Ages gives us a lot of flourishing in the arts, in literary endeavors, and I think we need to, again, like I've said already, reorient ourselves as to what the Middle Ages is all about. He goes on to say, every way in which a poet can write, including some in which he had much better not, is classified in the arts of rhetoric. There was nothing which medieval people liked better or did better than sorting out and tidying up. Of all our modern inventions, I suspect that they would have admired the card index. Now, of course, Lewis is writing pre-computer, and his focus would be on the card index, like you go to the library and you pull out, the way I used to do research. Okay? But now, of course, we've got other ways to do it. Hey, these Middle Ages people, these medieval people, they probably love the way that things can be organized today through our technology. So Lewis says that's the focus of these people. Right? Further, he says, but there is a third work which we can, I think, set beside these two. This is the medieval synthesis itself, the whole organization of their theology, science, and history into a single, complex, harmonious mental model of the universe. Now, we've been talking about the culture. We haven't yet talked about how do they see the universe as a whole. And we'll see that a lot of that is borrowed from Greece, but they carry it into the Middle Ages, and it's a universe filled with meaning. Now, it's not the same universe that we think about today and the scientists have told us about. The medieval concept of this universe is entirely different. And this is something that Lewis expostulates on as well. And it's where I want to go next time as we continue our view of the medieval worldview.